All right, so we are going to talk about the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, PCL-R. It's worth noting some brief history about psychopathy to understand it as a construct. So early accounts of the construct, there was an emphasis on violent and antisocial behavior. In the 1800s, we see um, an emergence of Picard's moral insanity and themes reflecting disinhibition or externalizing behaviors. We also see an emergence of Partridge's sociopath, who are individuals exhibiting a pattern of emotional volatility and impulsive reactive violence. We also see the emergence of the concept of the charming psychopath in the early years of its development. Kraepelin labeled these individuals exhibiting characteristics such as glib charm, lacking in basic morality or loyalty to others, and to be very attention seeking. Schneider in 1934, so this is after World War I, he characterized the group of symptoms here as an abnormal personality that could afflict an individual in varying severities. Schneider's work also added to the emergence of another set of characteristics of psychopathy, those of emotional coldness and callous exploitation, which he saw as being attributed to a lack of emotional sensitivity. Pinnell also contributed to this idea in 1962. So now we're at the Mask of Sanity, Hervey Cleckley. So this was thought to be the foundation for modern conceptualizations and measures of psychopathy. So Cleckley had direct experiences with psychopathic persons, or what he deemed psychopathic, in an inpatient psychiatric facility, and he wrote about them. And he saw a presence of severe underlying pathology masked by an outward appearance of robust mental health. So that is how he viewed psychopathy. He came up with 16 specific criteria, which I didn't list because of space. And they were separated into three different categories: positive adjustment indicators, behavior deviance indicators, indicators of emotional unresponsiveness or impaired social relatedness. Based on Cleckley's research of psychopathy, Robert Hare describes psychopathy as a socially devastating disorder defined by a constellation of affective, interpersonal, and behavioral characteristics, including egocentricity, impulsivity, irresponsibility, shallow emotions, lack of empathy, guilt or remorse, pathological lying, manipulativeness, and the persistent violation of social norms and expectations. He describes psychopaths as superficially charming, self-serving, and manipulative. So Hare in 1996, he reported that psychopaths make up approximately 1% of the general population and about 15 to 25% of the prison population. He also thought that they were responsible for a markedly disproportionate amount of serious crime, violence, and social distress in every society. And it's interesting that later we'll look at the uses of the PCL-R. He said it was never meant to be used in criminal justice, so it's kind of interesting that he's reporting these facts here. So Hare developed the Psychopathy Checklist Revised in 2003, which again was based broadly on Cleckley's characterization of psychopathy. Newman et al. 2014 suggested that the PCL-R conceptualizes psychopathy as a superordinate construct underpinned by four first-order factors or dimensions. So they are listed here: interpersonal, affective, lifestyle, and anti-social characteristics, antisocial being the hallmark characteristic of psychopaths. Okay, so this is kind of the makeup of the PCL-R. It consists of two scales representing the construct of psychopathy. Factor one is measures callous, selfish, remorseless use of others. It measures interpersonal features and affective features. Factor two measures chronically unstable and antisocial lifestyle features. So yeah, lifestyle features and antisocial behavior features. It has 20 items and they are rated, so the person is rated for lifetime presence and severity on a 3-point scale on each of the items. 0 is absent, 1 is partially present, and 2 is present. And they are added all up at the end, so it's a total score of 40 is the highest. Clinically significant score would be 30 or higher. That's what Hare says in his manual. It is for administration for people 18 years of age or older. It requires a level C administration qualification to administer. It's quite a long instrument to complete with somebody, and it's rather intensive because it can include an interview portion, which can be 90 to 120 minutes, a collateral review, which can be an hour, and the assessment, which takes 15 to 20 minutes. So this is just a visualization of what we just kind of went over. You know, I like graphics, so I just included this. And this is just taken from one of Hare's papers. So you can see here some of the items that are on the PCL-R and his other instruments. He did make one for youth, and then he also made one as a screening version. So it's a shorter version that some people use just because it's shorter, just for screening purposes. So given that I did not have access to the PCL-R manual, this information comes from the work of other researchers in the field. So the PCL-R manual contains normative samples of a variety of kinds. So one of the normative samples they provided was of about 5,400 males who underwent a standard assessment, and they based this assessment on an interview and a review of case history information. So with this sample, they found the average score to be 22.1 with a lifetime prevalence of about 21%. This data is used to convert raw scores into T-scores and percentile ranks, but the specifics were not mentioned in the story article, which is where I got most of this information. So they had a second normative sample of about 2,600 males of correctional offenders in Canada and the United States, and they assessed these offenders via file review only. So this is just based on a review of case history information. And with this sample, they found the average score to be 16.5, and they did not record a lifetime prevalence with that one. The Hare 2003 manual also provides summaries of PCL ratings for various diverse groups. So they provide it for male and female correctional offenders and forensic psychiatric patients in Canada, the US, the UK, and Sweden. The normative samples in the PCL-R manual were constructed by pooling samples of convenience rather than systematically sampling offenders or patients. So it's possible that these norms are not representative, which is actually what Story et al. 2016 were investigating. Speaking of Story et al., Story and colleagues evaluated the generalizability of psychometric evaluations reported in the test manual of the PCL-R for offenders in the United States and Canada. So they used a representative sample of male offenders and assessed them via the file review method. And what they found was that their findings were very similar to the results reported in the Hare 2003 test manual, which suggested that number one, the pooling of diverse samples in the test manual did result in normative samples of the United States and Canada that are likely representative of various offender populations in those countries, and also lends support for the validity of psychopathy as a mental disorder and the PCL-R as a measure of psychopathy. The Hare 2003 manual reports high reliability and high concurrent predictive and construct validity. So with the high predictive validity, Evans, they found psychopathy as a robust risk factor of future violence, and the predictive validity was largely contributed to characteristics in factor 2 rather than factor 1. The PCL-R is also thought to have high inter-rater reliability and also high internal consistency. There is some debate as to whether this shows psychopathy to be a unitary construct or not. There's also support for the PCL-R being valid and reliable across cultural groups. For example, in the Indigenous prison population in Canada, German prison population, Spanish prison population, and Swedish. So just to expand a little bit more on the psychometric properties of the PCL-R, it has been shown to have a strong convergent validity, which indicates strong construct validity. It correlates really well with the PPIR, which is the Psychopathic Personality Inventory, another instrument used to measure the same construct. And it also correlates significantly some of the facets of the PCL-R. They correlate significantly with constructs of what is known as the triarchic model of psychopathy, which is a more modern conceptualization of the term. So what the triarchic model of psychopathy purports is consists of three facets instead of the two factors. And what they have named them are boldness, meanness, and disinhibition. So the boldness factor of the triarchic model significantly correlated with both the interpersonal and antisocial facets of the PCL-R. The meanness characteristic had significant correlations to all facets of the PCL-R, and the disinhibition characteristic showed strong associations with the social deviance traits of the PCL-R. Uses of the PCL-R. The PCL-R was noted in Hare 2016 to be the international standard for the clinical assessment of psychopathy for both basic research and applications to the criminal justice system. So it's used in the criminal justice system and correction system to assess for recidivism and risk for violence in offenders. So what these researchers found was the estimated reconviction rate in the first year following release was twice as high for psychopaths, 83%, compared to the other offenders. And I put psychopaths in quotations because that's just a label that Robert Hare really likes to use. I don't know about the labeling of that. That is probably an ethical implication to talk about. But yeah, anyways, there was an international survey done by Neil and Grisso, and what they did was they surveyed forensic researchers and practitioners all over the world and as to what they used most in their assessments. And the PCL-R tied for most frequently used tool for violent risk assessment. It came in second for most used for sex offender risk assessments and civil commitment evaluations, and came in fourth for use in sentencing assessments. It has also been used with the following populations and demographics: offenders from diverse cultural backgrounds, female offenders, adolescent offenders, and substance abusers. Legal and ethical implications. So assessment results from the PCL-R, they need to be considered among other factors and evidence in order to have a comprehensive understanding of the risk an individual poses to society. So doing an accurate and correct assessment of an individual is really important because it could have implications for their entire life, especially if it is going to affect their sentencing, whether or not they get paroled, whether or not even they face capital punishment in some of the states in the United States. So there is potential for abuse of the PCL-R in the criminal justice system. So again, it's essential for assessors to have proper and sufficient training in assessment and be well versed in their field and the current research of the construct of psychopathy in order to, do these assessments correctly and in good faith. So psychopathy, kiss of life or kiss of death in the first degree murder cases. It can be considered either an aggravating or mitigating factor in criminal responsibility. Hare asked us to think about that because there are consequences for both. If it's considered an aggravating factor, we might see these individuals get put away forever. If it's considered a mitigating factor, we could be possibly looking at trying to rehabilitate these people, or they may get released. And if they reoffend, there's consequences for that too. Hare himself does not believe that they can be treated or rehabilitated, which is interesting. I also wanted to note this case because it was Canadian. So, a federally sentenced Métis man successfully sued the Canadian federal government in 2015 on the grounds that he had been harmed by the Correctional Service of Canada through the use of the PCL-R and certain actuarial tools. His legal team argued that the instruments were not culturally appropriate and that insufficient research had been conducted examining their psychometric properties with Indigenous people to warrant their use. Unfortunately, the decision was overturned in 2018. The federal government determined that the plaintiff, who was the Métis man, failed to establish that the use of the assessment tools generated false results and conclusions when administered to Aboriginal persons. So there is still some contention there as to whether or not it fairly assesses people of diverse backgrounds, especially Indigenous populations.